Bye.
Yo, what is going on, everyone? Today we have another Ben solo cast. Some things have transpired with Ethan this morning. He's doing okay. No one needs to worry, but he is extremely close to competing, which means that as the days get closer, he will just progressively become more fatigued and more run down. And where we can, we want to eliminate that stress for him. And so, in the context of today's episode, we're going to be talking about all things that are more so Ben related, Ben specialty, which some of you may like, some of you may hate, some of you may have already skipped this episode because Ethan's not here, and I totally understand that. In terms of the coming weeks, I'm not sure how this will play out. He competes in about 5 weeks, but we're just going to play it by ear week to week. Maybe I will get some other guests on here just to spice it up so you're not listening to me and me alone for the next month and a half or so. And Ethan also, by the way, has another competition that's like less than a month after that one. So we'll figure it out. We'll play it by ear. And hopefully that's okay with all of you. So today I really want to dive deeply into a topic which we alluded to a couple episodes ago in relationship to the discussion of injury and specifically how we can conceptualize injury. And for those of you that didn't listen to that podcast, we basically just went over a little bit of a theoretical framework first for injury and then a practical framework in terms of how we conceptualize it and sort of how to manage it when it does happen. And so if any of you are interested in that, I believe that was 2 episodes ago, definitely check it out. But we basically define injury as this kind of tipping point, right? Where we go past our capacity to tolerate a specific load in a specific position for a specific amount of reps, sets, etc. And so what we kind of concluded in that episode was um, that injury is really this gross outcome, this amalgam of a ton of different variables that sort of all feed into this thing that we call injury, which is really just, hey, this is for whatever reason more stress than this particular structure or group of structures can handle. And I wanted to address one thing that we did not address in that podcast first. And then today's topic is going to be more so on the biomechanics side of things, which I think I can speak to at least with some degree of competency. And I want to go through a lot of practical tips in relationship to troubleshooting, just discomfort, not necessarily injury, because discomfort and injury are a little bit different. Injury is this more clear sort of hard line in the sand where it's like we can't really work around it, at least not in the ways which we would find productive from a hypertrophy standpoint, a strength standpoint. So we'll talk about that in a second. One of the things that came about in the past couple of weeks, just since we released the injury episode, is some people have been talking about how injury, and I've heard this espoused and repeated, I don't even know where it started, but someone at some point said that injury is basically this conversation of applied load being greater than tissue tolerance. And I think that there's some degree of truth in that, meaning that, like, hey, maybe we're in a position wherein the amount of load that we're using for a given exercise is more than we can handle, right? But injury is actually a lot more than that. And so, we talked about it for an hour in that episode, which was not a very long time to be talking about injury, in my estimation, just because of how many inputs there actually are. So, this kind of quip of the applied load being greater than the tissue tolerance is maybe useful, but in my estimation, it's too myopic of a perspective to actually be accurate or to actually approximate the truth in any kind of more specific way. So what I mean by that is when you say that injury is just a simple equation of I used too much load and therefore I got hurt, what you neglect are all of the things that led up to that incident. Right. So I've mentioned this on a couple episodes, but there was one day about a month ago where I bent over and I tweaked my back picking up my cat. Okay. This was not a situation where the applied load of my cat was greater than the tolerance of my left lumbar erector group. Right. And that's essentially what I felt tweaking. Right. I have deadlifted over 600 pounds before. Right. And I find it hard to believe that the way in which I picked up my cat was such that the applied load to that specific joint structure was more than it could tolerate, right? But the day prior to that, I had done a lot of stuff in the gym from a lower body perspective that I had not normally done. I had done some stuff from a spinal perspective that I had not normally done. And so for whatever reason, and this again is still a little bit of a myopic perspective, from one day to the next, for whatever reason, there was just something in there that can't be explained, that is impossible in some ways to explain, that just said, hey, not today. Okay. And so in that particular case, when we say things like the applied load was greater than I could tolerate, what does that really mean, right? What people are implying is that injury and these kinds of traumatic incidents, right, physically, can be reduced down to that incident alone. And I think that that is too narrow of a perspective to even really be useful. While again, I still do think that there are incidents where, and these are the clips that you normally see online where like people are, benching 5 plates on an incline press with like all kinds of wraps and straps. And, they have the whole BDSM setup basically to be able to, make a video for social media and they end up tearing their pec, because they basically just have turned themselves into like, a machine with all the equipment that they have on themselves. That's a situation where it's like, okay, maybe, they were handling stress fine. And in this one particular case, it was just like the amount of tension that the tissues could create was just so far below the amount of force that they needed to produce that like that was the limiting factor. That was the thing that structurally couldn't handle it. But most injuries do not occur that way. Most people are not pressing 5 plates on an incline press, right? And so just the summary there, before I move on, is that we can't really reduce this conversation down to a single thing, and we can't even reduce the conversation around pain to a single thing, right? So there's an overwhelming body of evidence to suggest that pain cannot be reduced down to even a physical structure, like our ability to assess, structurally speaking, whether or not the status of a particular joint will cause pain or will not cause pain is horrible. People literally have lumbar vertebrae that are like 50% deviated from the normal position of a vertebrae, that don't have pain. People who have perfectly normal looking spines can have tons of pain, right? So although this conversation can get really muddy, I think that ultimately, in terms of how we can practically apply these complexities to training, are just that we take a guess with a specific amount of volume. We be conservative with exercises that we haven't done before or that are novel given a time frame, right? And we do less than we think that we probably need to do, for a given time frame, and we slowly grade the exposure to that motion. That's going to apply ultimately to any exercise that you can do, any activity that you can do, right? If you go from never hiking in your life to going on a 6-hour hike, it's likely that the next day you're going to wake up feeling like shit somewhere, somehow, right? Just because that's the way that our body works, right? It's essentially just this conversation around how much total magnitude of stress am I dealing with and how can I respond to that, right? And this, by the way, doesn't just include the physical, this includes the cognitive, right? So if you're going through a time period in your life, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this if you're training for any length of time, if you're going through a very stressful time period in your life, it's likely that you'll see consequences physically manifest in the gym, whether that, be injury or not, or something more minor, something that's more of like your mood or your digestion or your sleep, whatever. All these things are related, right? So I like to think of stress, whether it comes to the physical or the cognitive, as just this big bucket, right? And how much we fill the bucket is really going to determine what the sort of outcomes that we see. And I like to think about it from the perspective of Ethan's definition of injury in this whole tipping point conversation, where it's like, yeah, we get to a point where the bucket is too full and it starts to overflow. Okay. And can we be super precise about that? No, that's just the nature of the game. And that's just the reality of these kinds of conversations. These kinds of conversations don't have simple answers, and the truth is never simple. And especially when we're dealing with a system like the human system, we just have too many different inputs to be able to whittle this thing down to a single variable. Okay. So with that said, I'm going to ironically talk about a single variable, which are joint mechanics and the biomechanics stuff, but take this within that framework, right? And the reason I'm sort of going on this little ramble before I even talk about how to manage the discomfort is to appropriately contextualize this conversation and to say that, like, hey, these are a couple of different variables that we can play around with and that we can use to troubleshoot. And hopefully there are some practical takeaways that you all have from today that will influence your decision making in the positive direction of the gym. Okay. So this came about via the questioning of a modern meathead newsletter subscriber who basically just asked the general question of like, hey, Ben, like, how do I deal with discomfort in the gym? And again, while there's not a answer to that question, I want to sort of go over my framework for how I conceptualize troubleshooting, discomfort, or rather just moving in the direction of more comfort, regardless of what exercise you're doing, regardless of who you are, where you are in your training career, and whatever else. So where we can start this conversation is with first identifying a goal as usual, right? So in order to perform an exercise, whether consciously or not, we have to have some kind of goal. So for now, and I'll use this example. I'll try to keep it consistent throughout this thread so that we can sort of just apply the different concepts to the same exact scenario and not be jumping from concept to concept or exercise to exercise. Let's just take the example of a bench press. Okay. Everyone loves a bench press, right? So a bench press we perform specifically to train tissues that are on the front side of the shoulder. Okay. Why that happens is a little bit more of a longer conversation, but we all intuitively know that when we lie down on a bench and perform bench presses, stuff on the front side of the shoulder joint, i.e. the pecs, right? All the different portions of the pecs, the front portion, of the deltoid, upper, middle, lower pec, as well as the tissues like pec minor that play a huge role in stability and that kind of motion will play a role, right? And in addition, tissues that are on the backside of the elbow, i.e. the triceps, if you want to go there, the anconeus, right, which is also technically an elbow extensor, all those tissues that sit on the backside of the elbow will also contribute to that kind of pressing motion, especially because we're dealing with a fixed implement kind of thing, which we'll talk a little bit more about how that might be different if we choose a little bit of a different kind of press. So given that we have that context of we have our goal, we're doing a bench press, we're training our pecs, the first place that we need to start when we're trying to deal with this discomfort thing and troubleshooting discomfort is we need to assess what kinds of joint ranges, what kinds of ranges of motion are comfortable and, quote unquote, naturally sort of feeling for us prior to executing that exercise. So the number one mistake that I see people making when people are dealing with any kind of discomfort is they simply just haphazardly are lying down on the bench or, getting set up for whatever exercise they're doing. They pick the load that they think is going to be appropriate for them. Maybe they have previous data to suggest that like this load is appropriate or whatever. Maybe they do a warm up, right? Working up to that weight, but along the way, they're not really assessing what kinds of ranges feel comfortable to them without the addition of loading. Okay. And so what I mean by that is people will lie down on a bench press in this example, and they'll grab the bar, they'll slap a plate on there, and they'll just start pressing. Right. And sometimes that works out. Sometimes, if you're someone who's lucky, genetically blessed, joint structure blessed, biomechanically blessed, you oftentimes will see people go very, very long stretches of time, if not their entire career, without ever running into an issue. And if you're one of those people, it's unlikely that you're listening to this podcast, but at the same time, you maybe have those kinds of exercises in your program that just never have felt really badly. In my personal experience, and this is sort of part and parcel why I'm so into the biomechanics thing, there is pretty much no joint in my body that at some point I have not felt discomfort in while trying to execute an exercise. So my motivation for learning all this stuff really has come from that. I am someone who is, in some ways unlucky from the perspective of like my joint structure and how exercise historically felt for me. But in another way, I do feel lucky that that has been my experience because I've been able to really dive deeply into this stuff to figure out how to troubleshoot it, right? And hopefully many of you will benefit from that. So sort of starting place number one is that we need to assess comfortable ranges prior to performing the exercise. So what that means in the context of a bench press is I'm going to lie down on a bench and I'm not going to grab the bar. I'm just going to lie there first. And I'll do this with clients every time I have a client or a situation, whether it be a new client or a recurring client who is laying down doing a bench press. I'll say, okay, just talk to me about like how your body feels when you're just mimicking whatever you think a bench press should look like. And some people, and this is literally, I'm just describing literally what I will do, is I'll tell people to like go through the bench press motion without the bar in their hands. And some people's arms will naturally fall a little bit tighter to their body, right? Like you can think of this as like the elbows sort of tucked to the sides kind of variation. Some people, though, will lie down on the bench and go through that motion, and their arms will be closer to 90 degrees away from their torso. Now, of course, there are nuances in terms of like, what am I trying to target with this exercise and how can I be more specific to that? But I actually think that the first thing that needs to occur is we need to assess where our joints are naturally a little bit more comfortable. And this is not a perfect test. This is not a perfect assessment, but it does give us a little bit of information about where this person's bones might naturally want to direct their structures, right? So again, some people will get down, and this is usually the people with a flatter type of sternum, a posture, if you will, that's a little bit more sort of slumped over, a little bit of shoulders hunched, and they'll lie down on the bench and they'll do something that looks much more like a close grip bench. And then again, another person, perhaps of a different physical archetype, will do something that looks much wider. And once they've gone through that range of motion, I'll just be like, hey, how does this feel? Does it feel clunky? Does it feel like you're listening to like your joints crackle and pop like you're making popcorn? Or does it feel like smooth, like butter, like, nothing feels weird? It's just, it's great. And so I tend to lean people in the direction of, let's just make sure that this feels comfortable without any added load. Again, that's not going to be perfect. There will inevitably be changes with the addition of load and with the addition of more load as a consequence of progressing that exercise. But just as a starting point, I think this is a really, really good place to start. And so from that point, I'll say, okay, you feel good in this particular range. You feel like your arms are naturally going to be comfortable moving upward and downward. Let's now grab the bar and let's start to add some load. And because of the constraints of a bench press, things may change. Things may not change. But however they change, I want to make sure that as I continue to progress, as I continue to add load, that things don't feel too dissimilar from how they felt initially. Again, load will change things. Resistance will change things. And we'll talk a little bit about, just in a little bit here, how you can troubleshoot this if nothing just seems to work out well. But let's just assume that for now, this person lies down, they go through their comfortable path, they grab the bar, and they can mimic that comfortable path. No problem. Great. That's a good starting point. And guess what? If you have done this, if you have assessed that comfortable range prior to adding more load or any additional load besides the weight of your arms, you are likely 100 steps ahead of the average person who will just go and grab the bar and start pressing the bar, or more than that. Okay. So that's step one. Now, step number two is once you've acquired this comfortable position and once you've now started to add load, now we start to need to pay attention to a couple of different things that sort of need to come in tandem. So the first thing that needs to be prioritized is this concept of control. I've previously defined control in a couple of different episodes, but I'll go over it again here. I personally define control as your ability to resist the resistance of the exercise, right? So it's kind of a mouthful, but let's think about this just simply. If I'm doing a bench press, and I know that the resistance of a bench press is, again, trying to shove my arms, my hands, all the things in my upper body, right, my upper extremity down toward the floor. I know that in order to resist that resistance, I need to be pushing upward, right? I need to be pushing against the direction of resistance. And so if at any point I am no longer pushing upward, but rather I am allowing the bar to sort of free fall downward, that is no longer, in my estimation, that person controlling that exercise, right? That's a situation where essentially the bar is free falling, and where at the bottom of the motion, where joint forces will inevitably be the highest for a couple of different reasons, that's a specific strategy wherein the person is losing control over the weight, right? And so you see this a lot, especially with beginners. You see this even in advanced people who maybe have a better idea of what works for them. And so this may be valid for some people at that level. But oftentimes I do find that more often than not, people who have discomfort are not controlling tempo. And again, it sounds very obvious, but I really like to start by moving slowly before moving quickly, right? And this applies to any skill. This doesn't just apply to exercise. This doesn't just apply to a bench press. This applies to learning guitar, right? This applies to learning any kind of more fine motor skill, which would require some degree of focus and some degree of technique, right? Like I started learning guitar when I was in college, however many years ago. And one of my friends who was nice enough to help me learn, she basically said to me like, "Hey, Ben,
you're gonna want to like strum quickly. You're gonna want to move through the chord progressions quickly, the scales quickly. But like just for now, as you're learning, try to just sort of take each individual component of the chord, take each individual sort of step within the scale really slowly, and make sure that before you try to move too fast, you actually understand, okay, where does the pressure in my fingers need to be? What sort of strategy do I need to use to strum each chord? What strings do I need to strum within each chord, right? There are all those sort of nuances that are very, very important to make sure that you capture initially so that later on, right, when you're trying to do more advanced things, you haven't skipped steps and you haven't sort of ended up in a position where you have to relearn things because you didn't take the time initially to do it. And again, people who have been lifting for, any length of time think that they are beyond this, right? And so what oftentimes happens is like we often will start to skip steps where maybe initially in the beginning phases of our career we maybe were taking them a little bit slower. If you're introducing a novel exercise, if you haven't bench pressed in a year and you're just starting to bench press again, even if you've been training for a decade, you need to sort of treat that skill as a new skill, right? Because your body is essentially recognizing this thing as a novel stimulus, as a foreign stimulus, and your brain will not understand exactly how to coordinate that motion, right? So to use the guitar parallel here, what I often found was that in the initial phases of, let's say, like learning a scale, I was really careful about understanding where to put the pressure in my fingers. I was very careful about strumming each individual string slowly. But as I got a little bit cocky, as I got more confident in my abilities, to a point where I shouldn't have been, I started to sort of skip over those steps. And so what I had to do later on was I had to actually slow back down to make sure that I was strumming the correct strings. I had to make sure that the pressure on my fingers was on the appropriate portion of the fret and all those different kinds of things. So this applies directly to exercise in that if you try to move too fast, too quickly, right, bad things are going to happen. And many of you may be thinking, well, Ben, duh, that's obvious, right? But a lot of people I see in practice, even people who have been training again for a decade plus, constantly are forgetting this when they introduce something that is novel or something that they haven't done in quite some time. Okay. So step number one, assess the comfortable joint ranges. Do your bones feel like butter, or does it feel like you're crackling and popping? Does it feel like you have some measure of discomfort? If you do, play around with the position that your arms are directed, right? So again, if you're that narrower person and your arms may initially have felt comfortable pressing more narrow, but then you start to add load and all of a sudden it feels clunky again, don't be afraid to play around with where you're directing your elbows, what arm path you're using. Don't be afraid to play around with the pressure in your hands. Does it feel better to squeeze the inside of your palm, or does it feel a little bit better to squeeze the outside of your palm? Does it feel better if you have a balance between those two things, right? All these things are things that we can play around with, which we'll discuss a little bit more in length in just a little bit here. But once you set that initial path, try to stick to it initially, see how it feels, add some load, and move slowly before you move quickly. All right. So those are steps 1 and 2, and make sure that you are constantly sort of checking in with yourself and you're constantly making sure that as you go through these motions, again, whether you're learning something or you're relearning something, or you're trying to troubleshoot discomfort, that you are resisting the resistance. So again, in the context of a bench press, I'm really going to try to direct people's attention to their hands, specifically where pressure is in their hands. And I'm always going to try to get this person to remember that, like, hey, as I'm pushing the bar off of my chest, I'm obviously thinking upward. And people don't have a difficult time thinking about the upward direction that they need to push, excuse me, on that pushing portion of the motion. Where people lose control is when they have to think, okay, I'm pushing away from me, but I'm also allowing the bar to lower. That's not something that's nearly as intuitive or nearly as simple to conceptualize, right? So as this person is lowering the bar, I need to get them to remember that they are pushing their hands toward the ceiling, even as the bar is descending toward their bodies. And again, this is counterintuitive, right? Because in order to lower a weight that I can control and press it in the context of like doing reps of a bench press, I need to remember that in order to push the bar off of me, I need to create more force against the bar than the bar creates against me. But in order to lower the bar, I need to grade the amount of pressure that I push into the bar so that I can actually descend, right? I need to create less force into the bar than the bar is actually pushing against me. But you need to make sure that you're not forgetting to push as you lower, right? So again, it's kind of counterintuitive because it's almost like you're doing a pull while you're still pushing, but that is a skill that can transfer across all exercises, right? So if I'm doing a row and I am pulling and I'm pulling backward, let's say I'm doing a chest supported row, it's easy for people to remember or to conceptualize that, like, okay, I'm going to pull the handles behind my body as I go through the concentric or shortening portion of the motion. But it's often more difficult for people to remember that I need to continue to pull. I need to use that intent to pull as the weights are coming forward in front of my body, right? So just sort of the inverse example being, a pulling motion as opposed to a pushing motion. And what is the difference between those two things? It's just the direction of resistance, right? And obviously what is recruited and what stability I need to create as a consequence of that. Okay. So step one, assess the comfortable range. Step two, make sure that you're resisting the resistance. And I'll just caveat this by saying, as you become more advanced at a particular skill, you can use higher amounts of acceleration as you become more advanced, right? So this is where now there's a little bit of nuance in terms of like, okay, well, you don't want to be moving at eventually, you don't want to be moving so slow, right? That if you're, let's say, a 315-pound bench presser, you are benching 135 for sets of 5, right? That's obviously not going to be enough weight, enough stimulus for you to actually call upon your tissues, your nervous system to be able to push the needle forward and to progress forward, right? So you need to eventually find a balance of not moving too slowly, but moving slow enough to where you're still operating under or within the window of control. Okay. So let's now imagine a situation. We're taking the next step, step number 3 here, where you've assessed that comfortable position for you in the context of the bench. You have focused on moving slower as opposed to moving more quickly, and you are resisting the direction of resistance appropriate to that exercise. Let's imagine now that you're someone who, after step number 2, you feel totally comfortable. Great. No problem. You found the comfortable range. You're good on control. Door is open to add more weight. Door is open to continue to progress. No problem. But what if you're someone who gets to that point and you're like, this doesn't feel great. Still feels clunky. When I start to add weight, feels like the crackling and the popping or the discomfort is starting to rise. So the first thing that we need to do in this situation is, within the context of that exercise, assuming we want to do that exercise still, which we'll talk about in a second, we need to start to adjust joint positions to a greater degree. Okay. So in tandem with the first 2 considerations, now we can again start to play around with the different adjustments that we have available to us. So in the context of a bench press, maybe initially you had an arm path that was a little bit wider, right? A little bit more of like an elbows flaring out underneath of the bar type of thing, like out to the sides. But you find that when you start to add load, this doesn't feel great. From that point, we can start to adjust something like grip, right? So the first thing that I'll do in the context of a bench press is I'll say, okay, well, our hands were, a little bit, we'll say, a couple of feet outside of shoulder width, meaning that, like, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see me, right? But imagine just like your typical wide grip bench press where your arms are kind of flared out to the side. Maybe that was comfortable for you initially, but now it starts to feel clunky with load. Let's just see how a more tucked elbow position feels. And in addition to that tucked elbow position, you can play around with where you're actually gripping the bar, right? So if I gripped, outside of shoulder width initially, maybe I'll change it to about the width of a hand inward to see what happens when I do that. And when you adjust your hands a grip width inward, your elbows and your shoulders will need to sort of follow suit according to that change in grip. And so when you were sort of out wide, you had, joint forces A, and then when you move in, you have joint forces B. Well, what if joint forces B still doesn't feel, particularly good? Well, then we can maybe play around with, again, another adjustment in grip. Maybe you took too much of a step inward, and maybe you went too narrow. So maybe you need to adjust your hands a little bit wider and play around with that and see how that feels, right? Maybe that wasn't narrow enough, from joint force A to joint force B. And so maybe you actually need to go a little bit more narrow to where that tucked elbow position feels better. In my own personal experience, I have found that whenever I'm doing a bench press, the narrower the grip, relative to my frame, the more comfortable for me, right? And obviously that is up until the extreme of like my hands being close together and now I'm just doing a triceps kind of a press, right? I basically find the most amount of comfort when I assume an arm path where my arms are really nice and tight to my body. Again, in the context of a bench press, where I can kind of drive my elbows down sort of toward my nipples, and where my hands are a little bit tighter to my body, and where my hands, in terms of the pressure in my hands, is pretty evenly distributed, right? And so the step number three is basically like, let's play around with the available joint adjustments that we have. And something that's important to keep in mind is that this will, the amount of adjustability that you have across exercises will be directly dependent on the constraints of the exercise, right? So you only have so many options if you're going to use a barbell bench press. A barbell bench press is neither good nor bad, right? But how you perform it and how you relate to it in terms of the progression and the load that you're using makes it so. So if you're using a particular joint position that is not comfortable for you, that's not a good scenario, right? That's a bad scenario. If you're using a position which feels great to you now and over time where you're progressing the exercise, great, thumbs up, double thumbs up for a long time, probably. Okay. And so once you play around with the grip in the context of the bench press, you don't really have much else to play around with outside of moving away from that specific variation. So, what are some other things that we can do besides just adjusting the grip in the context of a bench that may help us? Well, if you're not a power lifter, guess what? You don't have to do a bench press. So, we'll talk about adjustments that you can make in that context. But first, if you do want to continue to barbell press, the next step that I would take is essentially adjusting the direction of resistance. Now, assuming that you are still tied to using a barbell, what you can remember is that although the barbell in and of itself will not be able to change directions, meaning that a barbell is a free weight. And so, like all weights, it uses gravity, right? And because it uses gravity, it's pulling toward the center of the earth. And because it's pulling toward the center of the earth, it basically wants to just fall toward the ground at 90 degrees. And so, if it wants to fall to the ground at 90 degrees, like a dumbbell would, like a barbell would, like a cable stack would, right? We only have so many options that we can use to adjust the resistance direction because we can't fundamentally change what the resistance is doing and where it's pulling. But what we can change is our body's position relative to that direction of resistance. So what I can do in the context of a bench press is I can adjust the angle of the bench, right? So instead of maybe doing a flat press, maybe I just angle the bench up 5 to 10 degrees. So I'll just go one setting up on the bench. And surprisingly, for a lot of people, this can feel completely different. Again, not really talking about the specific muscular stimulus and the joint forces at this point, but really what we're trying to do is basically just find something that within the context of a barbell press is similar enough, but that also allows us to find those comfortable positions and to maintain those comfortable positions as we add more load and as we progress, right? A lot of people are tied to this idea that they have to do specific exercises, that they have to do specific variations without the recognition that like your muscles don't give a shit about what implement that you're using. Of course, your joints give a shit, right? And so, in my estimation, if we are experiencing any measure of joint discomfort, we need to be able to play around with the direction of resistance. And the way that we do that with something like a barbell press is by adjusting the bench position. Okay. So once we have identified potentially a more comfortable bench angle, which by the way, could be 5 degrees higher, could be 15 degrees higher, could be 20 to 30 degrees higher. Once we find an angle which basically feels like, okay, this is a better angle for me, right? Now we can actually start to play around again with the initial things that we were playing around with. Why? Well, because the joint positions relative to where the resistance is are different, right? The incline bench press from a stimulus perspective will challenge different muscles slightly differently, and will, as a consequence of that, end up creating different joint forces and things that we have to manage. So even if you go from 0 degrees of incline to 10 degrees of incline, now all of a sudden you're dealing with a totally different force scenario, which makes no sense in terms of direct comparison to the initial thing. And so because you've adjusted the angle, and as a consequence, you've adjusted the direction of resistance relative to your body, what you can start to do now is play around again with that grip width thing. So I've seen this time and time again where people on a flat bench angle will not feel comfortable with a wider arm path. But the second that they raise the bench angle just a little bit, because the direction of resistance is different, now all of a sudden, maybe that initial grip that was not comfortable at the flat angle feels comfortable with the slight incline. Okay. So Once you change, and this is an important principle to take away from this, just overall in the context of any exercise, is if you change any setting of any machine, if you change any kind of angle within any free weight implement, if you change foot width, foot angle, stance width, tempo, right? If you change any of these things, you are dealing with an entirely different skill. All right. So maybe not entirely different. Entirely is not the best word, but you are dealing with a totally different set of joint forces and muscular forces and connective tissue forces as a consequence. And so now you can, again, start to play around with the things that we were talking about initially. So again, once you've adjusted that angle, maybe the wider arm path feels better. Maybe the narrow arm path feels better if the narrow arm path didn't feel so good, so hot on the flat angle, right? But you can start to see where this is going, which is like you have so many more options than you probably think in terms of the adjustability. And the likely difference between stimulus, between variations, is probably not enough to justify not choosing the thing that feels more comfortable for you naturally. Okay. So the same thing applies, let's say, to another scenario wherein you're doing like a pull down motion. Well, if I'm doing a pull down and I know that I want a relatively vertical direction of resistance, thus the pull down, maybe I grab the traditional lat pull down bar and maybe I do it like with a little bit of a wider grip, and maybe that doesn't feel too hot, right? But then maybe I use a little bit more of a narrower grip, like I'm doing a chin up kind of pull down, and maybe that feels better, but it doesn't feel totally great. Well, instead of being tied to needing to use the traditional lat pull down bar, maybe I will swap the bar and I will use something that's more of like a neutral grip bar. And maybe that automatically feels better and there's nothing else that I need to do. Maybe that still doesn't feel great and I need to adjust the width of the neutral grip. Maybe that still doesn't feel great. And instead of using two arms at the same time, I use a single arm, right? And so all these different scenarios, they seem like they're all sort of relatively very similar, but in terms of the joint forces and the amount of comfort that you can experience as a consequence, or discomfort that you experience, can be totally distinct even with these things that are apparently minor adjustments. Okay. So step one, comfortable range. Step two, tempo. Step three, or sort of strategy number three, is to adjust the joint position and the resistance direction. So now, before we sort of return to the bench press in a little bit, I want to just talk about how, you don't need to be tied to any particular variation, which is something I mentioned earlier, which is something that I think in the context of hypertrophy training, especially longer term, you need to get more and more comfortable trying out different things. So in the context of the goal of like, okay, I want to train my pecs and my front delts and my triceps, we have this thing that I like to call the pressing algorithm, which basically just means that I'm using a direction of resistance, which is challenging the tissues on the front side of the chest, right? Or on the front side of the rib cage, right? And so that doesn't just include a barbell bench press, right? It may be difficult to believe, but we actually do have other options in terms of pressing. So what other options might we have? Well, instead of using a barbell, we can use dumbbells, right? We can use dumbbells at a 0-degree angle. We can use dumbbells at a 10-degree angle, at a 20-degree angle, bench angle I'm referring to. We can use dumbbells with a wider arm path, with a narrow arm path. We can use dumbbells with a grip position, which is not changing throughout the rep. We can use dumbbells with a grip, which is changing throughout the rep, right? Maybe toward the bottom, it feels better to have your palms toward one another. Toward the top, it feels, a little bit better to sort of turn your palms sort of in front of you, right? All these different things are all these different adjustments that we can make. And what are you ultimately changing? The direction of resistance. Okay. Excuse me. And so I have a barbell bench. I have the different angles and the different grips. I have a dumbbell bench, the different angles, the different grips, the different arm paths. What else do I have? Well, I have cables, right? And I can adjust those cables unlike a barbell. I can pretty much adjust those cables in an infinite variety of ways relative to how I'm loading, right? So I can, angle the cables so that they're kind of slightly outward and a little bit wider. I can angle them so that they're more directly backward. I can use a wider arm path, a narrower arm path, and all the different grip adjustments that we mentioned with the dumbbells. In addition to that, I can do something like a machine press, right? I can, if any of you have a really nice chest press at your gym, right? You can sit down on that chest press and you can adjust the seat height. You can adjust where you're gripping. You can adjust where the pressure is in your hands. You can adjust the range of motion that you're using within the context of that exercise, which we'll talk a little bit more about in just a bit here, right? But hopefully the principles are now becoming more clear, which is that you do not have to be tied to a single implement because ultimately what you're trying to challenge is this more general algorithm of, okay, I have these pressing tissues and I can challenge them. And again, a potentially infinite number of different ways. And so don't be tied to the bench. Don't even be tied to the barbell press. Don't even be tied to the cable press. Play around with these different things and play around with all these different kinds of subtle joint adjustments and angle adjustments and just find like, okay, what is the thing that just feels good to me? It feels like butter. What is the thing that doesn't feel, crummy, that doesn't feel like my joints are popping or in any measure of discomfort? And again, within the context of each of these exercises, you have all those different adjustments that you can make, joint position and how that changes resistance direction to achieve those same goals, right? So many, many, many different roads to Rome. I don't know if that's a saying. Many different maps that you can choose and sort of lay out for yourself. Don't be tied to one. Okay. So, in addition, and this is sort of one of the things that I find is a little bit more troublesome to communicate to people that are very tied into a specific mode of thinking or a specific strategy that they've used maybe in the past, which is adjustment of range of motion. Okay. So when we talk about range of motion, oftentimes this conversation gets very generalized, right? And so what we tend to think of as range of motion is how much is the implement that we are using moving through space, right? So in a barbell press, to go back to and stick with our original example, most people think that full range of motion of a barbell bench press is touching the bar all the way to your chest and then pressing the bar all the way to where your elbows are locked out over your face. And I'm here to let all of you know that that is arbitrary bullshit. Okay. Why is it arbitrary bullshit? Well, because what matters in terms of range of motion are our joints. And what doesn't matter in terms of range of motion is how much the implement is moving through space, right? Because the implement tells us nothing about what our joints are doing, at least not directly. So if I'm creating an arbitrary standard for my client who maybe has some kind of shoulder structure, who maybe has some kind of muscular architecture, that is specific to them, that for whatever reason, at no angle, at no grip width adjustment, feels good to touch the bar to their chest. Am I going to force the bar to touch their chest? Absolutely not. And the people that claim that you need to touch the bar to your chest have no concept of, I think, what actually matters in the context of exercise and what is actually relevant to analyze in the context of exercise, which is, what are my joints doing? What is the muscular response as a consequence of what my joints are doing? And how does that feel? Am I accomplishing the muscular stimulus that I want to? Am I using a range that feels comfortable for me? Because again, if you are tied to moving some sort of external implement an arbitrary amount of distance, then you will completely neglect what is most important about exercise, which is motion of our joints. And as a consequence, what our tissues need to do to manage that. Okay. So in the context of a bench press, right, I might put my client in a position where instead of lowering the bar all the way to their chest, what I will do is I will make sure that they're lowering to a point that feels comfortable. So go back all the way to the first example that we talked about today, which might be, okay, instead of trying to lower the bar to my chest using a wide grip, narrow grip, grip adjustment, right? Instead of trying to do all that different stuff, maybe instead I'm just going to say, hey, let's lower the bar to a point where it does feel comfortable, because a lot of people will experience discomfort and pain in a very specific portion of the range, but not all of the range. And I think that's something that's really important to take away from this, which is that if there is a portion of the range of motion which does not feel good to you, okay, let's in the bench press, let's say the last 10% of the range where you're touching your chest doesn't feel good, just simply stop the freaking bar earlier than your chest, right? Stop it above the level of your chest. Now, social media and Instagram will freak out if you do a bench press where you're not touching your chest. But again, just remember that motion of the implement is not relevant. What is relevant is motion of the joints and our response compared to that, or in relationship to that. Okay. So don't be tied to a specific range. Now, what if, for example, the bottom feels like butter, right? The bottom of the bench press feels like butter, and the top half just feels crummy, right? Which could be for a number of different reasons. In this particular case, we're not going to get into that side of things. But in terms of what might feel better or worse, stick to the portion of the range that feels better. Again, a lot of these things are somewhat intuitive when you hear me elucidate them, but I do find that a lot of people have these arbitrary ties to specific amounts of range, to specific implements that prevent them from being able to troubleshoot these things simply because, again, they're not really questioning why they're tied to these things to begin with. Okay. So again, in the context of the bench press, let's say that bottom 10% feels crummy. I'm just going to eliminate that bottom 10%. And in a lot of cases, what I actually find is that over time, if I avoid that sort of crummy portion of the range, that portion of the range tends to open up more often than it doesn't. And it tends to feel good more often than it doesn't. And so I think this is really interesting because it kind of speaks to, what I was talking about earlier with pain and discomfort, where people may actually be, from a structural perspective, totally capable of performing a specific portion of a range with a specific amount of load, but for whatever whatever the reason might be, maybe if it's previous injury, maybe it's their brain sort of beating them to the chase, a portion of the range might not feel comfortable. But in my opinion, when the body starts to recognize and when the muscles start to recognize, like, hey, this is actually something that's okay, we can tend to actually find more range of motion within the context of those exercises if we expose ourselves to some amount of that range that is comfortable. A lot of times the body will sort of open up range and create more comfortable range once it sort of recognizes that, like, hey, this is not a dangerous thing. This is going to be a thing that's okay for me. And so is that my goal with any client or myself? Is it my goal just to sort of continue to use more range of motion arbitrarily? No. But if it happens, it happens, right? And oftentimes when it does happen, it's usually a sign that this person is getting better at the skill. Maybe they are getting stronger in the particular positions that they weren't before. And now maybe they can open up some range to expose themselves to a little bit more challenge, to expose themselves to a little bit amount of more comfortable path of motion. Okay, my cat is really trying to distract me here. Cheerio, cheerio. Come here, come here. Sorry. So in the context of this bench press example, maybe again, in that sort of initial phase, that bottom 10%, not so good. But as I start to grade myself slowly to that position, maybe it starts to feel better. And guess what? If it never feels good, I'm totally fine with just cutting out that portion of the range. I see no significant problem with that whatsoever. And again, we're using the example of a bench press, but continue to imagine these different scenarios, which may be sort of in terms of your initial analysis of the exercise, very different, but in principle, they're the same. So for example, if someone is doing a free weight squat and it's like the majority of the range feels awesome, apart from the bottom 10 to 20%, well, in the initial phases, I'm not going to concern myself with the bottom 10 to 20%. People get really, really lost in these sort of more nuanced conversations around like, oh, I'm not getting a full stretch on the muscle. And right, all those kinds of things need to come secondarily, tertiarily to this whole comfort within the context of any different exercise. Now, let's assume, and this is kind of going to be where I start to conclude things, but where, knowing me, I'm going to start to ramble, or I'm going to ramble more than maybe necessary, but I want to make sure that you all have this context because I think it's important. Let's assume that you've worked through the comfortable range, step one. Let's assume that you've gone through controlling the range of motion, resisting the resistance, that whole thing. And let's assume that you've played around with all these different angle adjustments, with all these different directions of resistance, with all the different variations and joint position that you can create, with all the different variations in range of motion within different contexts that you can create. Now, if you've truly gone through all that and you've truly played with all of those different variables across most variations, if you are a person that does not have some kind of structural or chronic pain type of issue, some kind of neurological issue in relationship to the motion, it's very, very unlikely that you will not be able to find something that is comfortable. Okay. And when I say something that is comfortable, I now am speaking more to a muscle output perspective. So for example, if you are tied to only doing presses to train your chest and you can't seem to find a press that feels good, you can also do something like a fly, right? You can also basically load the joint in a way which is different from a direction of resistance perspective, different from a setup perspective, different from an implement perspective, but that still trains the tissue itself, right? You can still find ways to load those tissues that are not just, okay, I'm doing a press, right? And in the context of, a pulling motion, we'll say, instead of doing pull downs, you can do rows. Instead of doing rows, you can do reverse flies. Instead of doing reverse flies, you can do pull-ups. Instead of doing pull-ups, you can do shrugs, rows at different angles, coming from straight forward, coming from the sides, whatever. You get the point. But if you have checked all of those boxes, again, which most people, if you've checked all those boxes and you've truly, truly gone to the deep end of what you can experiment with, now it's time to say, okay, instead of trying to train these muscles specifically, now we need to start to think about how we can still just train the joint, okay, instead of hyper focusing on the muscle. So what do I mean by this? When we're doing a bench press, okay, what we are primarily loading are the glenohumeral joints, the true shoulder joints, the sternoclavicular joints, which are the joints basically where your clavicle is attached to your sternum, and the scapulothoracic joints, which are the joints basically between the scapulas, the scapulae, and the rib cage. Okay, those are the primary joints that we're loading, in addition to the elbow and the wrist and the forearm, right? Secondarily, tertiarily. Now, if I cannot find a way to load my pecs with a press, fly, or anything in between, now it's time for me to say, okay, I can still find a way to load these joints while not specifically loading those muscles. So, for example, if I can't find a way to load my pecs, I still need to remember the fact that my pecs act on my shoulders and my shoulder girdle. So if I can use an exercise strategy which still loads my shoulders and my shoulder girdle, like a pull down, like a row, like a reverse fly, like a shrug, if I can find any of those variations with any kind of loading directions and any kind of non-specific muscular goal, that's probably a net positive. Okay, so for example, if I have someone who, for whatever reason, cannot find a way to do any measure of press, any measure of fly, or any kind of chest motion, right? And I've really gone to the deep end to trying to troubleshoot that stuff. Now I'm going to say, okay, what other muscles cross the same joint, act around the same joints that I can train pain-free? So in a lot of cases, when people have pain with pressing and pain with doing flies, they can still do things like pull downs. They can still do things like lateral raises. They can still do things like pull-ins. They can still do things like reverse flies and shrugs. The list goes on. And so the principle-based takeaway from this portion of the conversation is essentially that you have joints and your joints have muscles. And when you use specific directions of resistance, you load those joints and you load specific muscles in one specific way. But if you are still loading the joint, that is probably a net positive relative to just skipping all things related to that joint to begin with. If you can't do presses, try to do pulls. If you can't do pulls, try to do presses. If you can't do presses or pulls, try to do lateral raises at varying angles. Try to do reverse flies at varying angles. Try to do shrugs, right? All these things are options for us to go through, which can still load the same joints, right? Because inherently we're still loading the same structures in one direction or another, the same connected tissues in some way or another, which might actually allow us more wiggle room to be able to train those more problematic motions with more comfort. So a very classic example of this is when people will say things like, on leg day, I like to do leg curls before leg extensions, right? Why do people like to do that? Well, the specific reason I can't really speak to, could be very different from person to person, but the principle here and the principal takeaway here is that if I'm doing a leg curl, even though I'm primarily training all the muscles that bend my knee instead of my quads, I'm still training the knee joint. I'm still putting force through the connective tissues that have to stabilize the knee. I'm still putting force through tissues in the hamstrings, the calves, the sartorius, the gracilis, right? All those things that bend the knee, which have to coordinate that motion, which, by the way, again, is just force around the joint. So if I can train the joint in a way which is non-specific to the problem motion, in a way that's pain-free, that is probably where I'm going to start. Again, if I've really sort of gone through all these other things and all these things have run its course and I'm not sort of seeing the results that I want to see. So again, very clear example of this in the upper body might be, I like to train biceps before triceps. Why? Well, because you're loading the wrist, you're loading the hand, you're loading the elbow, you're loading the forearm, you're loading the shoulder. All of those joints are involved in a triceps extension, but those joints may not feel particularly good going into the triceps extension first for whatever reason we don't have to get into, and which is ultimately impossible to really break apart at an individual level, right? And so once you've gone through all those different kinds of adjustments, you've gone through all the things that are, you know, supposed to help you feel more comfortable in the context of a motion that is not comfortable, then you can start to play around with, okay, how can I load this thing differently? And how can I find a way to basically just load the joints and load the same structures without actually using the forces that were problematic to begin with. So I'll conclude by giving a concrete example of this and just sort of reiterating what I've gone through so far. I mentioned earlier when I bent over to pick up my cat that I had a little bit of a back tweak. So how did I go about doing that? Well, the first thing that I did was I assessed, just without any sort of added load, just in a standing position, what motions of my spine don't feel comfortable. So for me, extending my spine, like arching my back and rounding my spine, did not feel good. Neither of those things felt good. Rotating my trunk, so keeping my hips stable and just sort of turning side to side, that felt like a 7 out of 10 good, maybe 8 out of 10 good. So not too problematic. Side bending, right? So lateral flexion of the spine, bending side to side, felt completely pain-free. So the first thing that I did was, instead of jumping to the things that were more immediately problematic, is I jumped to training the joints of the spine, which there are a lot of, by the way, 72, I think, to be exact. I jumped to training the joints in my spine in any direction rather than trying to address the thing that did not feel particularly good. So the first thing that I did was I went into the gym and I started training like oblique motions, side bending motions for my abs. And then once I did those things, the rotation went from about a 7 or an 8 out of 10 good to a 10 out of 10 good. So I started training rotation, and the flexion extension, the thing that had initially hurt, actually hurt a lot less. So with my own body weight, I was able to actually start to load some of that motion in a relatively pain-free manner. So the takeaway here is, don't be tied, even in the context of like, you can't work around this specific motion. Don't be tied to that motion and those forces. Look at the joints, take a couple of steps backward and look at the joints more from a gross perspective and ask yourself, how can I load these joints in a way that is not loading those same muscular tissues and those same connective tissues in that exact same way? How can I load these things in a non-specific way? Oftentimes, when you're able to do that, remember, you're still loading the joint, you're still putting force through the joint, and you're creating motion in the joint. And how might that actually open up range in the initially painful or problematic scenarios? Right. So that, for me, flexion extension didn't feel great. So I went with the side bending. That felt good. And after a couple of days, it was like I went from, like what was probably an 8 out of 10 pain to basically 0 out of 10 pain in less than a week. Right. And so that is a very specific thing relative to me. If you have a more serious issue, a more traumatic issue, that will obviously be different. If it's a chronic issue, that's also different, right? But just to sort of illustrate the concept, that's kind of how I worked through that particular scenario, which was, specific to me. So overall, again, with this whole troubleshooting thing, we identify what positions feel more comfortable rather than less. And for the initial phases, we're going to stick to those. That includes the joint position. That includes the resistance direction. That includes how the joint positions change throughout the exercise. That includes what kinds of things like bench angles or anchors we're using, all those different things together. They're all overlapping. You can't separate any one of them from any other. Second, we're making sure that we control these motions. We are resisting the resistance. We are moving slowly before we're moving quickly, but we're also not afraid to progress the acceleration of the exercise once we're comfortable. As a layer sort of on top of both of those things, we're making sure that we're not tied to using specific ranges of motion that are arbitrary to the implement rather than to the joint positions that feel good for us. And we are experimenting with and allowing for increased range only when increased range feels good. And guess what? If it never feels good within the context of a loading scenario, we don't force these things. We don't try to push past where we feel comfortable. And then lastly, once we've done that and we've experimented with all those different things, we experiment with different motions or different loading directions for the same joint. which may be training tissues that are not the problematic tissues. But again, if we are loading the joints and we are putting force through the joints and through the connective tissues, that is going to be a much better scenario than not loading anything at all, or just simply trying to bang our heads against the wall to be able to push through the thing that is inherently going to be uncomfortable for us for any length of time, which cannot ultimately be determined. So keep in mind that these are ultimately strategies. They're all principle based. Experiment around, use these concepts. Maybe you only need to apply one of them. Maybe you need to apply every single one of them. And maybe, there's a very quick timeline of going from discomfort to comfort. Maybe it's a very long timeline, but ultimately just don't be tied to any one thing and don't assume cause where you're not able to. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully you enjoyed this solo cast. I have no idea what next week or the following weeks will hold, but regardless, there will still be an episode a week. Whether it's just me or me and Ethan or me and another guest, we will see. So if you've made it this far, thanks all for listening. Hope this was helpful, and I'll see you all next week.